Hello and welcome back to Karen's Colours. I'm Dr. Karen and this is my Conversations in Colour. Before I get started today, I'd like to thank my very first subscriber. It's wonderful to know that there's someone out there who appreciates the work that goes into these videos. Thank you very much. May there be many more of you. Now, in the last few weeks, I've been looking at different types of colours that people have chosen as their strength. This week, I thought I'd try something a little different. What I intend to do is to demonstrate to you how a colour analysis actually is done. That is, from the beginning to the end, and I'm going to be using an actual case. This case has been totally de-identified, so there's no way you'll find out who it was that chose these particular colours. But I will be doing the analysis to show you how the colour analysis proceeds and what the steps are in order to obtain the information that I then give out to people. So let's get started. I've entitled this session, Colour Analysis, the How and the Why. So I guess one of the questions you might have in your mind after having watched my previous videos is why start with idioms? Well, idioms give us clues to what the colours actually represent, and those clues are given in terms of commonly understood meanings. And they're confirmed by those common understandings. Every culture sees colours slightly differently, not just visually, but also in terms of what those colours mean in idiom terms. However, as Western culture has started to take over the rest of the world, we find that common understandings are becoming far more widespread. It also exposes the positive and negative aspects of each colour. As we've seen with the idioms of both red and blue, which I've talked about in previous videos, and if you haven't seen those, I will link them in the description. Those positive and negative aspects of each colour allow us to have a broad idea of just what colours mean in terms of how we see those colours as human behaviours. Before we begin, though, I need to create a caveat. Idioms depend on the length of time since the basic colour term was created. If we have an older basic colour term, such as red, which is the very first of our colour terms, then we find that there are many, many more idioms associated with that colour than with any subsequent basic colour terms. The more recent basic colour terms have fewer videos, and the more recent they are, the fewer colour idioms there are associated with them. New basic colour terms, such as the one that I have added to my repertoire, that is cyan, don't yet even have idioms, despite the fact that it is a recognisable, distinct colour. When we use our printers, we use the colour cyan as one of the basic materials for creating colour printing, but we haven't had it in our language for long enough for us to have created any idioms. So let's have a look at some of the examples of idiom uses. Black always refers to all things that are hidden, and it can be occult skills such as intuition, but also it can lead to depression. So we have a good end, that is the intuitive end, or the psychic end, as some people would prefer to call it, or we have the depressed end, where the person withdraws inside themselves and is unavailable. That is, they are occult, they are hidden, and their personalities don't shine through. For white, it's all things visible, and that stands to reason. Black and white are opposites. And here we have clarity. We have scattered energy. People who have white personalities tend to be all over the place all the time. And on the other hand, we have dissembling, which basically comes down to telling lies. For red, it's all things that require attention. So we have passion, and that can be seen as purposive action, that is the things that we intend to do, but it also can see out of control emotions. Yellow is all things mental. So we have digestion of things such as learning new information, but at the other end of the spectrum of yellow, we have anxiety and fear. For green, it's all things that are desired. We've already met green as the colour associated with values. So we have new growth, that is new ideas, new things being incorporated into our personalities. And at the other end, we have decay of those things. And those values are things like jealousy and envy and just plain nastiness. Blue is all things that are structured. And here we have organisation, peace and quiet, and on the one end of the extreme, and at the other end we have rigidity, an inability to bend or change rules. And then we have brown. These are all things that are planned. They are purposive, hard work at one end and total impracticality at the other. Purple is all things creative. And here we have change that occurs. We can have reimagining of the way that things are to make something new, or we can completely destroy whatever there is that is existing in the real world at that time. For orange, it's all things that are challenging. So we have survival mechanisms that are put in place here. Courage, on the one hand, is seen as an orange characteristic, but on the other hand, so is crisis. Crisis occurs when orange is overpowering and the person can't cope. Then we have pink. These are all things unplanned, and they are associated with connection or connectivity. We have love and surrender being one end of the spectrum, and that is when a person can't say no. At the other end of the spectrum is the person who says no to everything and anything and is only centered around their own immediate needs and desires, and we see that as selfishness. For grey, it's all things unexpected. And here we have confusion as the primary theme. You can have indecision at one end of the spectrum and absolute gaslighting at the other end of the spectrum. Either way, it is not being something that is clear and easily recognized or understood. And then finally, we have cyan. Now, for cyan, we don't have idioms, as I've already mentioned. But for me, it is the colour that represents all things that are connected to one another. And so we have communication, trust and friendships on one end, loneliness and the inability to relate to other people, a lack of empathy, in other words, at the other end of the spectrum. And that's a very brief overview of all of the idioms as I use them in my colour analyses. Now, what do the colour pairs mean? The upper section and the lower section have distinctly different properties and so therefore have different results as the colours that they represent. In the upper section, the action is exhibited by the individual. We can see what the person is doing. And it's usually a purposive response to a stimulus. There's something that happens either from an internal trigger or from something in the environment, and as a result of that, the person behaves in a particular way. The lower section of these colour pairs is the drive underpinning that action. It's the motivation, it's the trigger that causes a reaction in the real world. It's usually a protective response to a stimulus. So the person has a stimulus from the environment, instantly there is some sort of action put in place internally, and that action then is driven into the upper section, into the real world, and the person does something as a result of that stimulus. When both colours are the same, that is the top and the bottom exhibit the same colour, then that generally shows that there is a rigidity of intention and action. The person has a response to an outside stimulus and reacts in exactly the same way as that response is perceived internally. That rigidity can become very problematic for a person because they often do not know how to change their behaviour. Why am I using the yin and yang symbol? Well, have a look. As it rotates, you can see that there is always one colour that is dominant in the top section and one colour that is dominant in the bottom section. It is weighted. So therefore, the yin-yang symbol allows us to have a look at how the colours of the unconscious, that is the internal colours, and the conscious, the external colours, interact with one another. The stimulus and action will bleed into one another. There is always a little bit of the unconscious desire or need or drive that sees its way into the real world, and there's always something about the activity that occurs in the real world that will influence the need or drive or motivation that comes from within. The data that I'm going to present now is collected from real cases. And as I've mentioned before, there have been thousands of cases that I have reviewed. Each client that came for a colour analysis had a specific need or a purpose for that reading. They wanted something, and usually that something was a change. The choices are reactions to the questions asked. I asked some simple questions. They don't seem to make much sense, but all the same, the person is asked to choose the colours that best describe the answers to those questions. And those choices that they make represent the unconscious knowledge that the person has about themselves. So their choices reflect their personalities. It has nothing at all to do with how I or anybody else would perceive that person. The colour readings were part of a treatment modality. I did a number of other things with these people. It wasn't just a colour reading, but this was the precursor to those other treatments. And those treatments were aimed at altering the perspective the person had about themselves and their world, but also how to control, manage, alter, and otherwise reimagine their emotional reactions to the things that they felt impinged upon their everyday lives. Now, what were those initiating questions? Well, the most common one was, who are you? And that question outlines the person's basic personality. So we have two choices that are always represented by that first question. And they are the strength. And in the first reading where I looked at colours in terms of strengths, the most common one was, of course, blue on blue. Far more common than any other colour combination. The obstacles for these people were either yellow or green as the most commonly presented obstacle. In other words, the strength the person had and the deficits they had, the things they could do well and the things that they could tried very much to avoid. They were limited by the purpose of the question. I only want to know what the extremes are of the person's personality. They're also associated with current circumstances. If the person came a week later or a week earlier, then chances are the colours may have been different as far as choices go, because people's situations change from day to day, sometimes hour to hour or even minute to minute. So whatever is going on in the real world now is how that person perceived themselves in terms of the question, who are you? And when we link those strengths and weaknesses together, it tends to upset status quo. So it doesn't really matter whether the yellow is in the top or the bottom of the dual, or whether the green is in top or bottom. They cannot be sustained for any length of time. Let me just give you a demonstration. Here I have a duality. Red in the top, blue in the bottom. For those of you who have already gone through the videos in which I've dealt with these colours, you would know that blue in the interior tends to suggest that the person needs, above all things, needs and desires and is motivated by peace and quiet. In the real world, red means sudden explosions. A person has to make a lot of noise, can be quite aggressive in order to be able to maintain whatever it is that is below. But these are dual colours, and one of the things about dual colours is that when we mix them together, you can achieve a different colour altogether. But there is a problem with this. Because we have now mixed a strength and a weakness together, the two colours begin to separate out. In other words, the motivation separates out from the action, and it cannot be sustained for any length of time. Now, as you can see here already, The blue, the internal driver, has separated out quite readily, as it always does. And in the top of the bottle now, we're starting to see the red come through. No longer is this a purple action or purple response. In other words, complete destruction of whatever it is that caused the irritation in the first place. But gradually we're finding we're getting back to the status quo of I need peace and quiet, and in the real world I may have to organize that in a way in which I am the boss, I make the decisions, and as a result of that, you will do as you are told. This is the reaction that we get from this particular color combinations, but it applies to all color combinations. So let's get back to the previous combinations that we had. Here, when we have yellow and blue together, we end up with the color green when we mix them. But you can see from the blue and red here in this little bottle, it doesn't take long before the colors separate out again. So it doesn't matter whether that person's obstacle becomes the driver or whether it becomes the action, or whether the person's strength becomes the driver or the action. And similarly with green and blue. With green and blue, we get a turquoise type color. And this also will separate out quite readily because it cannot sustain that need to keep the two colors within the same action-reaction cycle. The unsatisfactory responses that arise from these combinations are sometimes quite detrimental. And so we need to be very careful about how we mix up those things that we can do well and those things that we don't do very well at all, or spend a lot of effort in trying to avoid. Now, having asked, who are you? The next question is about the present. And the question I usually ask for this is, what are you up to? And in this particular instance, I'm going to be looking at specifically one of the cases that I started to talk about last session. This is the person who showed themselves as being red as their dominant colors. In other words, they were the second most common group of people. And one of the issues that was very common to a red person was a purple obstacle. The environmental triggers will stimulate those patterns of behaviors. And these lead to specific responses. That is, I am dominant in my real world. A problem arises in that there is a sudden change, and that sudden change can be something as simple as a surprise birthday party. But any sort of change is seen as a challenge, and those challenges will instantaneously be regarded as a crisis. And that's what the specific response will be. I will treat change or challenges as a crisis to be managed. And these crises will not only influence the environmental triggers, that is, they go back and have an effect on both the red and the purple of my personality, but they in turn will be the most common way that I will respond to any of the issues that arise in my life. They can do so by direct influence, that is, the red and purple together will immediately create an orange outcome, or the orange outcome will be seen by me as either a red or purple issue to be dealt with. And it influences the environmental triggers because it changes my point of view. My expectations are that if I am challenged by anything at all, it's going to be a drama, a big crisis, or if a crisis occurs, it's because it's a personal challenge to me and to my personality's integrity. Now that leads us to the future. Now the future question is, where are you headed? The patterns that are created by these three questions are cyclical. They provide a sense of comfort. If you know how you respond, or you're always responding the same way to a particular issue, then you know where it will go eventually because you've gone through this cycle many, many times before. The expectations and the results are known aspects of your way of existing. Your unconscious is aware of how things will proceed when you do X rather than Y as a result of A, B, or C in the environment. So here we have the red and purple personality who is now in a state of crisis. Ideally, the personality colors, that is the red and the purple, will also appear in the future colors. The color links are important because they allow me to see immediately where the cyclical issue is. And in this particular instance, this person had cyan over red. So the primary issue was one to do with red, with being red. The drive internally to domineer, to be in charge, to have things my way are absolute. And in the real world, after a crisis has occurred and I have used my personality, my red and purple, to deal with it, then the end result is peace and harmony all over again. That cyan has to do with everything back in its place the way it should be, according to me. It demonstrates that the stimulus that sets the cycle in motion again has been found and has been dealt with. And the black and white colors can stand in for any color as that link. So if I didn't have red in that final fourth combination, then either black or white would have been just as useful, because both black and white contain all colors without necessarily showing any specific type of color. No color links, however, denotes an element of uncertainty. And these people, and there aren't very many of them, are often in a state way beyond crisis. Their entire lives have been upset and they have an issue in moving forward. So how do we create change with this information? Well, what our primary aim is to activate those skills that are not currently in use. What are those? Well, these are the colors that have been left out of the story. If I were to describe to a prospective client what each of these colors means in terms of a skills repertoire, then they would consciously choose those that they feel they need. But I don't tell them this to start off with. What I do is I ask them instead to choose which is the most liked color and which is the least liked color out of those that are missing. In other words, what's the best and the worst of what skills are not being used at present and what issues are being avoided. So we have here an issue where the person has to make a choice unconsciously, just like they did with the other questions that I've asked. And once they've made their choices, then I will tell them what those skills represent as things for them to do. And what did this person choose? Grey on white. What does this mean? Well, we know that white has to do with all things that are visible, but it also is a lot of scattered energy. And when white occurs in the unconscious section of the combination, in other words, in the interior, it means that the person needs to empty out all expectations, all drives, all motivations. And grey in the real world, while it can be confusion if it's internally, in the real world, it represents the ability to deal with things as they occur realistically without expectations and just let nature take its course. We need to be able to get rid of any expectations. We need to clear the mind. Meditation usually helps with that, but it's just one of the ways in which we could deal with this issue. The light color in this particular case happened to be grey, and it's the most effective skill that can be enhanced out of the colors of the skills that were missing. So this establishes new skills, and we do this by enhancing the current skills. The person not only can continue to do what they've always done, but now they can do something different as well. And that encourages new skill creation. Not only are we enhancing their skills, but we're also increasing the repertoire that is available to them. It broadens their abilities. And when you broaden a person's abilities, you give them greater choices. And with those greater choices, there are different outcomes. And that stimulates novel action. The person doesn't have to do what they've always done before. They can do something different. And by doing something different, they will get different outcomes. And that sends all of their patterns into a new direction. And hopefully, because that's the purpose of the readings and the treatments that go with them, is that it sends those patterns in new directions, and those directions will be profitable for that person and make them feel better about themselves and their situation. The end result is that the personality is still able to revert back to the skills that they've always used, but each time that they are stimulated to use those skills, things will be a little bit different because they now have other skills that they can call on when necessary. So there you have it. A colour analysis done all the way through. So hopefully you've enjoyed the presentation and maybe learnt something about yourself as well. Maybe you're one of those people. But certainly the important thing to remember is that when we take our strengths and our weaknesses and we mix them up, we may get a little bit of change for a very short period of time, but eventually it all settles out to be exactly where we were when we started off. Maybe you'll join me again for the next one. I again would like to thank my subscriber, and maybe you'd like to become a subscriber as well. If you've liked the session so far, give it a like, maybe even hit that notification bell, and I will catch you next time. Bye.